My name is Evelyn Parker, and I have lived in Portland, Oregon for nearly all of my 70 years. Family has always been my anchor, and for most of my life, I tried to be that anchor for everyone around me. Well, I was the eldest daughter in a family of five, the first to marry, the first to have children, and as it turned out, the first to bury a husband. My late husband, Richard, was a kind and steady man, and together we built a life that was simple but full of love. We had one son, Brian, who was the center of our world from the moment he was born. I poured every ounce of my energy into raising him, teaching him right from wrong, and making sure he never felt the kind of loneliness I had known as a child. Now, as I stood in the quiet of my living room, the morning sun barely filtering through the heavy curtains, I felt a loneliness so sharp it seemed to cut through my bones. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Richard's parents that had marked every important moment of our lives. Today, it marked the day I would bury my best friend, my partner, the woman who had been my other half for nearly 50 years. Helen, my sister by marriage, but my sister in every way that mattered, had passed away after a long illness. She was the one who had always known how to make me laugh, who had stood by me through every hardship, and who had loved Brian as if he were her own. The funeral was set for 11 o'clock, and I had spent the early hours of the morning moving through the house in a daze, making sure every detail was perfect. I polished the silver picture frames on the mantel, each one holding a memory of happier times Brian's first birthday. Our family trip to Cannon Beach, Helen and I laughing in the kitchen over a failed attempt at baking bread. I arranged Helen's favorite lilies in a vase by the front door, their scent filling the air with a bittersweet reminder of her presence. I checked and rechecked the guest list, making sure everyone who mattered would be there to say goodbye. Everyone, that is, except my son. Brian had called the night before, his voice casual, almost distracted, as he explained that he and his wife Sophie had planned a birthday celebration for her weeks in advance. "Mom, you know how important this is to Sophie," he said, as if that settled the matter. "We've already paid for the caterer, and her friends are flying in from out of town. I'll come by next week to see you." "I promise." I listened in silence, the phone pressed tightly to my ear, my heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. I wanted to scream, to beg him to reconsider, to remind him that Helen had been more of a mother to him than anyone else in his life. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could manage was a quiet, "I understand, Brian. Take care of Sophie." That morning, as the funeral guests began to arrive, I stood at the window and watched the cars pull up along the curb. Old friends from church, neighbors who had known us for decades, Helen's colleagues from the library, and even a few of Brian's childhood friends, all of them came, dressed in somber black, their faces etched with grief and sympathy. I greeted each one with a forced smile, accepting their hugs and whispered condolences. But inside I felt hollow, as if a part of me had been scooped out and left behind. The service itself was beautiful, just as Helen would have wanted. The pastor spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her unwavering faith. People shared stories of how she had touched their lives, how she had always been the first to offer help, the last to ask for anything in return. I sat in the front row, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to hold myself together as the memories washed over me. I glanced at the empty seat beside me, the one I had reserved for Brian, and felt a fresh wave of pain. It was as if his absence was a second loss, layered on top of the first. After the service, we gathered at the cemetery, a small group huddled together against the chill of the spring air. I watched as Helen's casket was lowered into the ground, the finality of it settling over me like a heavy blanket. I wanted to believe that Brian would appear at the last moment, that he would come running up the path, breathless and apologetic, ready to say goodbye, but he didn't. Instead, I stood alone, surrounded by people who cared, but none of whom could fill the space he had left behind. As the mourners drifted away, I lingered by Helen's grave, tracing the letters of her name on the polished stone, I thought of all the times she had comforted me, all the times she had put my needs before her own, and I wondered if I had done enough to deserve her love. I wondered if Brian would ever understand what he had missed, what he had thrown away for the sake of a party. When I finally returned home, the house felt colder than ever. I wandered from room to room, touching the objects that had once been part of our daily life: the teapot Helen had given me for my birthday, the quilt she had made for Brian when he left for college, the stack of letters she had written to me over the years. Each one was a reminder of the life we had shared, the family we had built together, and the emptiness that now threatened to swallow me whole. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I reached for the funeral program. I stared at Brian's name, printed neatly among the list of pallbearers, and felt a surge of anger rise up inside me. Without thinking, I picked up a pen and drew a line through his name, the ink cutting across the page like a wound. It was a small act, but it felt like a declaration, a way of acknowledging that something fundamental had changed between us, that the bond I had spent a lifetime nurturing had been broken in a way that might never be repaired. The phone rang later that evening, and for a moment I hoped it would be Brian, calling to apologize, to say he had made a mistake. But it was only my sister, checking in to see how I was holding up. I assured her I was fine, that I was stronger than I felt. But as soon as I hung up, the tears came. I cried for Helen, for the years we had shared, for the future we had lost. But most of all, I cried for Brian, for the son I thought I knew, and for the mother I had tried so hard to be. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I would not beg for Brian's love or his attention. I would not chase after him, trying to mend a relationship he had chosen to break. I would honor Helen's memory by living with dignity, by holding on to the values she had taught me, and by refusing to let my grief turn into bitterness. I would find a way to move forward, even if it meant doing so alone. In the days that followed, Benissa, I kept myself busy with the practicalities of loss, writing thank you notes, sorting through Helen's belongings, making arrangements for the memorial fund in her name. Each task was a small step toward reclaiming my life, a way of reminding myself that I was still here, still capable of love and kindness, even in the face of heartbreak. But every night, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I found myself reaching for the phone, hoping for a call that never came. I wondered if Brian ever thought of me, if he ever regretted his decision, if he understood the depth of the wound he had inflicted. I wondered if there was any way back from this, or if we were both destined to live with the consequences of his choice. As the days turned into weeks, I began to accept that things would never be the same. The routines that had once given my life structure now felt empty and meaningless. I found myself drifting through the days, going through the motions without really feeling anything at all. I knew I needed to find a way to move forward, to rebuild my life in the wake of so much loss. But I didn't know where to start. One evening, as I was cleaning out the hall closet, I found a box labeled Brian Memories. Inside were all the little treasures I had saved over the years: his first pair of shoes, the report card from his first year of school, the drawing he had made for me on Mother's Day when he was 6. I sat on the floor, surrounded by these relics of a happier time, and let myself cry for all that had been lost. I cried for the little boy who had once run into my arms, for the mother who had tried so hard to protect him, for the family that had once seemed unbreakable. When the tears finally stopped, I felt a strange sense of calm. I realized that I could not change the past, could not force Brian to be the son I wanted him to be. All I could do was accept the reality of our situation and try to find a way to live with it. I decided then and there that I would not let his choices define me, would not let his absence rob me of the joy and love that still existed in my life. In the weeks that followed, I began to reach out to others, to reconnect with old friends and family members I had neglected in the chaos of grief. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at the community center, and even signed up for a painting class at the senior center. These small acts of engagement helped to fill the emptiness inside me, gave me a sense of purpose and belonging that I had been missing. But no matter how busy I kept myself, there were still moments when the pain would catch me off guard, a song on the radio, a familiar scent, a memory triggered by the sight of a mother and son walking together in the park. In those moments, I allowed myself to grieve, to feel the full weight of my loss. But I also reminded myself that I was stronger than I realized, that I had survived worse and would survive this too. Looking back, I can see now that the funeral was not just a farewell to Helen, but also the beginning of a new chapter in my life. It was the moment when I finally let go of the illusion that I could control everything, that I could protect the people I loved from pain and disappointment. It was the moment when I realized that sometimes the only thing we can do is stand tall in the face of heartbreak and trust that, in time, the wounds will heal. I do not know what the future holds for Brian and me. I do not know if we will ever find our way back to each other, or if the distance between us will only grow wider with time. But I do know that I will continue to live my life with integrity and grace, to honor the memory of those I have lost, and to hold on to the hope that one day my son will understand the true meaning of family. For now, I will keep moving forward, one day at a time, trusting that the love I have given will not be wasted, that the lessons I have learned will carry me through whatever comes next. And as I sit here and in the quiet of my home, I find comfort in the knowledge that I am not alone, that I am surrounded by the memories of those who have loved me, and that, in the end, that is enough. In the weeks after Helen's funeral, I moved through my days as if underwater, every movement slow and heavy, every thought echoing with the weight of loss. The world outside seemed to carry on as usual, neighbors mowing their lawns, children riding their bikes down the street, the distant sound of traffic humming along Burnside Avenue. But inside my home, time felt suspended. I tried to keep busy, filling my hours with small tasks, organizing the pantry, dusting the bookshelves, watering the garden. Yet no matter how much I did, the emptiness lingered, a silent companion that followed me from room to room. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old linens in the attic, I stumbled upon a faded envelope tucked between two quilts. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Helen's elegant, looping letters that brought a lump to my throat. I sat down on the floor, the sunlight slanting through the attic window, and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, I found a collection of photographs, each one a snapshot of our lives together, Helen and me in our 20s, arms around each other at the county fair, Richard and Brian building a snowman in the front yard, Sophie, years before she became Brian's wife, laughing at a summer picnic. There was even a picture of Brian as a toddler, perched on Helen's lap. His face lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. As I sifted through the photos, memories came flooding back, some sweet, some bittersweet, all reminders of the years we had shared. I remembered the long nights Helen and I spent at the kitchen table, talking about our hopes for Brian, our worries about the future, our dreams for the family we were building. There were years when money was tight, when Richard's hours at the mill were cut back and I took on extra shifts at the bakery just to keep the lights on. Helen never complained, always saying, "He's our future. We do what we must for our children." Those words echoed in my mind as I continued to sort through the attic, uncovering more evidence of the life we had built around Brian. There were report cards, each one carefully saved and annotated in Helen's neat handwriting. "So proud of you. Keep working hard." There were birthday cards, hand-drawn by Brian when he was small, each one decorated with crooked hearts and stick figure families. I found the acceptance letter from the University of Oregon, the one that had made us all cry with pride, and the receipt for the first tuition payment, a sum that had seemed impossibly large at the time. Piecing together these fragments, I was struck by the sheer volume of love and effort that had gone into raising Brian. Every decision, every sacrifice, every late-night worry had been for him. We had poured ourselves into his future, believing that our hard work would be repaid with gratitude, with love, with the kind of family closeness that Helen and I had always cherished. But now, sitting alone in the attic, I couldn't help but wonder if we had given too much. If we had shielded Brian from the realities of life for so long that he had come to take our love and our sacrifices for granted? That question haunted me as I made my way back downstairs, the box of memories cradled in my arms. I set it on the dining room table and began to sort through its contents, laying out the photographs and letters in neat rows. I wanted to see the story of our family laid out before me, to understand where things had gone wrong. As I worked, I found myself growing angry not just at Brian, but at myself, at Helen, at the choices we had made in the name of love. It was a quiet, simmering anger, the kind that comes from years of disappointment and unspoken hurt. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I found myself staring at the empty chair across from me, the one that had always been reserved for Brian. I remembered the countless meals we had shared at that table, the laughter, the arguments, the moments of connection and misunderstanding. I remembered the way Helen would always save the last piece of pie for Brian, the way she would slip him a few extra dollars when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she would defend him, even when he was clearly in the wrong. But now, with Helen gone and Brian drifting further away with each passing day, I wondered if, in our efforts to protect him from pain, we had inadvertently taught him that our love and our support were things he could always count on, no matter how he treated us in return. The next morning, I decided to go through the family files in the study, a task I had been putting off for weeks. The filing cabinet was stuffed with decades worth of paperwork, tax returns, insurance policies, medical records, and tucked away in a manila folder labeled Brian, a detailed record of every financial contribution we had made to his life. There were receipts for tuition payments, checks written for car repairs, bank statements showing transfers to his account for everything from rent to wedding expenses. I was shocked by the sheer amount of money we had given him over the years, tens of thousands of dollars, all given freely, without expectation of repayment. As I tallied up the numbers, then a sense of disbelief settled over me. How had we managed to give so much without ever stopping to ask if it was truly helping Brian? Or if it was simply enabling him to avoid responsibility? I thought of the times he had called in a panic, needing money for some new crisis, and how Helen and I had always come to his rescue. No questions asked. I thought of the vacations we had postponed, the home repairs we had put off, the dreams we had set aside so that Brian could have what he wanted. And I realized, with a pang of regret, that we had never once asked him to do the same for us. That realization stung, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I saw our relationship with Brian for what it was, not a partnership of equals, but a one-sided arrangement in which we gave and he took over and over again. I wondered if he even realized how much we had sacrificed for him, or if he simply assumed that this was what parents were supposed to do. As I sat at the desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, I remembered Helen, not long before she died, asking, "Do you ever worry we've done too much for Brian?" I had brushed it off, but now her words echoed in my mind. I wrote down everything we'd done for Brian, not out of bitterness, but to understand tuition, down payment on his house, wedding, countless small loans, emotional support. I realized I couldn't keep giving like this, not when Brian didn't value it. I resolved to set new boundaries, to protect myself, and to honor Helen's memory by reclaiming my own life. In the days that followed, I stopped making excuses for Brian. When friends asked about him, I answered honestly. I let myself feel the anger and disappointment. Instead of hiding it, I joined a support group for parents of adult children, reconnected with old friends, and started volunteering at the food bank. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Helen's memory stayed close. Her lessons about resilience and loving without losing oneself became my guide. I knew there would be hard days, but I also knew I wasn't alone. One afternoon, leaving the food bank, I ran into Mrs. O'Leary from church. She hugged me and said, "You're stronger than you think." Evelyn. Her words reminded me that I could survive this loss and find meaning again. That evening, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a peace I hadn't known in weeks. I was ready to face the future, one day at a time. honoring Helen by living with courage and refusing to let the past define me. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought of Brian not with anger, but with hope that one day he'd understand what he'd been given. Until then, I would keep moving forward, trusting that the love I'd poured into him would not be wasted. The next morning, I woke to rain tapping the window. I made tea and looked out at the garden Helen had tended. The lilies she planted were blooming. Their color was a comfort. I resolved to carry her spirit with me, whatever came next. As I continued sorting through our shared life, I found a journal Helen kept during Brian's teenage years, filled with her hopes and fears for him. Reading her words, I was struck by her unwavering faith in his potential. I wondered if Brian ever truly understood how much he meant to her. I closed the journal and felt a new sense of purpose. Like I couldn't change Brian, but I could choose how to respond. I would honor Helen's legacy by living with integrity and compassion, focusing on what I could control, nurturing relationships that brought me joy, pursuing passions that gave my life meaning, and letting go of the need for Brian's approval. In time, I felt lighter. I laughed more, reached out to others, and embraced simple pleasures. Though the pain of Brian's absence remained, it no longer defined me. I was more than a mother or a widow. I was Evelyn Parker, a woman learning, at last, to love herself. As spring turned to summer, I looked to the future with cautious optimism. I knew there would be setbacks, but I was ready. One evening, sitting on the porch watching fireflies, I thought of Helen and smiled, grateful for the strength she'd given me. As the stars appeared, I felt peace not from forgetting, but from honoring the past and embracing the future. My journey was far from over, but I was not alone. Surrounded by love and memories, I promised myself to keep moving forward, to keep loving, and to keep believing in hope for Helen, for Richard, for Brian, and for myself. It was a gray morning in late March when the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet of my kitchen. I had just finished my second cup of coffee and was staring out the window at the garden, where the first green shoots of spring were beginning to push through the soil Helen had so lovingly tended. The air was still, and the only movement came from a robin hopping along the fence, searching for worms. I let the phone ring twice before answering, a small act of defiance, as if I could delay whatever news was coming my way. When I picked up, I recognized Brian's voice immediately. There was a forced cheerfulness in his tone, a brightness that felt brittle, as if he were trying to mask something underneath. He started with small talk, asking about my health, the weather, whether I had seen the latest news about the city council. I listened, responding politely, but I could sense he was circling around something. Finally, after a pause, he cleared his throat and told me that Sophie's birthday party had been a great success, but they had gone a little over budget. He mentioned unexpected expenses, the caterer, the decorations, the band, and then, almost as an afterthought, he asked if I could help them cover the bills. It wasn't a small amount. He named a figure that made me catch my breath, more than I had ever spent on a single celebration in my life. For a moment, I was silent. The phone pressed tightly to my ear. I thought of Helen, of all the times we had quietly made do with less so Brian could have more. I thought of the sacrifices, the careful budgeting, the years of putting his needs first. And now, just weeks after Helen's funeral, he was asking for money to pay for a party he had chosen over saying goodbye to the woman who had loved him like her own son. I felt a wave of anger and sadness rise up inside me, but I kept my voice steady. I told Brian that I couldn't help him this time, that I needed to focus on my own finances and well-being. There was a long pause on the other end, and then his tone shifted. He sounded hurt, almost incredulous, as if he couldn't believe I would say no. He reminded me of all the times I had helped him before, all the ways I had supported him, as if my love and support were obligations rather than gifts. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the phone. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight I had been carrying for years had finally been set down. I knew that saying no was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. I thought of Helen again, of her gentle voice and her unwavering belief in Brian's potential. I wondered what she would have said, whether she would have found a way to soften the blow or whether she, too, would have finally reached her limit. The days that followed were tense. Brian called again, this time with a sharper edge to his voice. He accused me of being selfish, of turning my back on my own family. Sophie sent a message as well, her words laced with disappointment and frustration. They both seemed to believe that I owed them something, that my refusal was a betrayal rather than a boundary. I tried to explain, to make them understand that I needed to take care of myself, but my words fell on deaf ears. I found myself replaying the conversation over and over in my mind, searching for some way I could have handled it differently. But each time, I came back to the same conclusion: I had done what I needed to do. I had drawn a line, not out of anger or resentment, but out of self preservation. For the first time in years, I was putting my own needs first, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. As the days passed, I noticed a shift in my relationship with Brian. He became more distant, his calls less frequent, his messages shorter and more formal. I sensed that he was pulling away, retreating into his own world, and I wondered if this was the beginning of a permanent rift between us. Part of me grieved for the closeness we had once shared, but another part felt a quiet sense of pride. I had stood my ground, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a piece of myself that I had long thought lost. It was around this time that I began to hear rumors about Brian's job. He had been working at the family business, a construction company that Richard had started decades ago and that Brian had inherited after his father's passing, for years. I had hoped that Brian would find purpose and fulfillment in the work, that he would take pride in building something of his own. But now, I heard whispers of missed deadlines, unhappy clients, and mounting debts. I tried to reach out, to offer advice or support, but Brian brushed me off, insisting that everything was under control. One afternoon, I received a call from the company's accountant, a woman I had known for years. She spoke in careful, measured tones, explaining that the business was struggling and that Brian's management had been erratic at best. She mentioned unpaid invoices, projects left unfinished, and a growing sense of unease among the staff. I listened, my heart sinking, as she described a company on the brink of collapse. I realized then that Brian's problems ran deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just about money or responsibility. It was about a pattern of avoidance, a refusal to face the consequences of his actions. I thought of all the times Helen and I had stepped in to fix things for him, to smooth over his mistakes, to shield him from disappointment. I wondered if, in our efforts to protect him, we had inadvertently taught him that he didn't have to take responsibility for his own life. The next day, I made a decision. I called the company's board of directors and asked for a meeting. I explained the situation as best I could, sharing my concerns about Brian's leadership and the future of the business. It was a difficult conversation, one that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable, but I knew it was necessary. The board agreed to review Brian's performance and to consider bringing in outside help. When Brian found out, he was furious. He called me, his voice shaking with anger, and accused me of betraying him. He said that I had no right to interfere, that I was undermining his authority and his reputation. I listened, letting him vent his frustration. But I didn't back down. I told him that I loved him, but that I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy everything his father had built. After that conversation, Brian stopped speaking to me altogether. Weeks went by without a word. I tried to reach out, leaving messages and sending notes, but he ignored them all. I grieved the loss of our relationship, but I also felt a sense of peace. I had done what I believed was right, even if it meant losing my son's affection. During this time, I leaned on my friends and support group more than ever. I found comfort in their stories, in the knowledge that I was not alone in my struggles. I spent more time volunteering, finding solace in the simple act of helping others. I poured my energy into the garden, tending to the flowers and vegetables that Helen had loved so much. The work was grounding, a reminder that life goes on, even in the face of heartbreak. Sometimes, I would pause and watch the bees drifting from blossom to blossom, or feel the sun warm my shoulders. And I would remember how Helen used to hum as she worked among the roses. The garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe and let my thoughts settle, where the world felt gentle and forgiving. As spring turned to summer, I began to feel a sense of renewal. I was still grieving, still mourning the loss of my relationship with Brian, but I was also learning to let go. I realized that I couldn't control his choices, that I couldn't save him from himself. All I could do was love him from a distance and hope that one day he would find his way back. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I thought of Helen and Richard, of all the sacrifices we had made for Brian, of all the hopes and dreams we had carried for him. I wondered if they would have understood my decision, if they would have supported me in drawing a line. I like to think they would have, that they would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself. In the quiet of that evening, I made a promise to myself to keep moving forward, to keep living with integrity and compassion, to keep believing in the possibility of reconciliation. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. I was learning, day by day, to let go of what I couldn't change and to cherish the love and support that remained. As the days grew longer and the garden bloomed in full color, I felt a sense of hope returning. I knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and sorrow, but I also knew that I was not alone. I was surrounded by friends, by memories, by the enduring strength of family, and in that knowledge, I found the courage to face whatever came next. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I would catch myself wishing for a sign from Brian, a simple message, a word of apology, or even just a sign that he was thinking of me. But I learned to let those wishes drift away with the evening breeze, trusting that, in time, both of us would find our own way back to peace. And as the stars appeared above the garden, I felt Helen's presence beside me, gentle and reassuring, reminding me that love endures, even through distance and silence. And in that soft darkness, I finally allowed myself to hope that forgiveness, in some form, might one day find its way back to both our hearts. And as I closed my eyes, I felt a quiet gratitude for the resilience that had carried me this far, and for the love that, despite everything, still lived quietly within me. The weeks after my decision to intervene in Brian's business passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I found myself moving through the days with a new sense of resolve, but also a heaviness that never quite left my chest. I had drawn a line, and though I knew it was necessary, the consequences were more isolating than I had expected. Brian's silence became a constant presence in my life, a shadow that followed me from room to room. I tried to fill the emptiness with routine tending the garden, volunteering, meeting friends for coffee, but there was no escaping the ache of a relationship that felt, for the first time, truly broken. It was during this time that I began to think seriously about my own future and about the legacy I would leave behind. Helen's passing had already forced me to confront my own mortality. But now, with Brian drifting further away, I realized that the plans Richard and I had made for our family no longer fit the reality of our lives. The house felt too large. The old family photos on the walls seemed to belong to another era, and the idea of leaving everything to Brian after all that had happened felt not only unwise, but deeply wrong. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of Helen's things, I found a letter she had written but never sent. It was addressed to me, and in her careful handwriting, she wrote about her hopes for Brian, her fears that we had given too much, and her wish that I would find the strength to do what was right, even if it was difficult. Reading her words, I felt a surge of clarity. I knew what I needed to do. The next day, I made an appointment with our family attorney, Mr. Callahan. a man who had known Richard and me for decades, sitting in his office, surrounded by shelves of legal books and the faint scent of old paper. I explained my decision. I wanted to change my will. I wanted to ensure that the house, the savings, and everything Richard and I had built would not simply pass to Brian by default. Instead, I wanted to create a scholarship fund in Helen's name to help young people in our community who needed a chance, the kind of chance we had always tried to give Brian. Mr. Callahan listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. He asked careful questions, making sure I understood the implications, and then began drafting the necessary documents. As I signed the new will, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I was not cutting Brian out of my life out of spite, but out of a sense of responsibility to myself, to Helen's memory, and to the values we had tried to live by. I hoped that one day Brian would understand. Word of my decision spread quickly, as things tend to do in a small town. At first, there were only whispers, curious glances at the grocery store, a neighbor pausing a little too long at the mailbox. But soon, the story took on a life of its own. Some people were sympathetic, telling me quietly that they admired my strength. Others were more judgmental, hinting that I was being too harsh, that family should always come first, no matter what. I tried not to let the gossip bother me, but it was impossible to ignore. I found myself dreading trips to the post office or the market, bracing for the inevitable questions. Even at church, where I had always felt safe, I sensed a subtle shift in the way people greeted me. Some friends drew closer, offering support and understanding, while others kept their distance, as if my decision might be contagious. Brian, for his part, was furious. When he finally called, his voice was cold and formal. He accused me of betrayal, of rewriting history, of turning my back on everything our family had stood for. He threatened legal action, insisting that he was entitled to his inheritance, that Richard would never have allowed this. I listened, letting him vent his anger. But I did not waver. I told him that I loved him, but that I could not reward behavior that had caused so much pain. Sophie, too, made her feelings known. She sent a long, emotional letter, filled with accusations and pleas. She wrote about the sacrifices she and Brian had made, about the life they had built together, about the injustice of being cut out after so many years. Reading her words, I felt a pang of guilt, but also a sense of resolve. I could not undo the past, but I could choose how to move forward. As the weeks went by, the tension in the community grew. Some people took Brian's side, insisting that I was being unreasonable, that I would regret my decision. Others, especially those who had watched our family from a distance, seemed to understand. They remembered the years of support, the endless second chances, the quiet sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. They told me, in quiet moments, that they admired my courage. The real turning point came at the annual Spring Festival, a tradition in our town for as long as I could remember. I had always loved the festival, the music, the food, the sense of community. This year, though, I felt a sense of dread as I walked through the crowded park. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispered conversations just out of earshot. I tried to focus on the children playing games, the smell of fresh popcorn, the sound of the band tuning up on the stage. It was there, among the booths and banners, that I saw Brian and Sophie. They were standing with a group of friends, but as soon as they noticed me, the conversation seemed to stop. Brian's face was tight with anger, Sophie's with hurt. For a moment, I considered turning around, but something in me refused to back down. I walked past them, my head held high, and joined a group of old friends near the lemonade stand. Later that afternoon, as I was helping set up the bake sale, one of the younger women in town approached me. She told me quietly that her daughter had been accepted to college, Basilio, but that they were struggling to afford the tuition. She thanked me for the scholarship fund, for thinking of families like hers. Her gratitude was quiet but sincere. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace. I knew I had made the right choice. The days that followed were a mixture of relief and sadness. I missed Brian, missed the easy conversations we used to have, the sense of belonging that came from being part of a family. But I also felt lighter, as if a burden I had carried for years had finally been set down. I spent more time in the garden, more time with friends, more time doing the things that brought me joy. It was during this period that the community's attitude toward Brian and Sophie began to shift. At first, people were sympathetic, offering words of comfort and support. But as the details of our story became clearer, as people remembered the years of help and forgiveness, the mood began to change. Some of Brian's old friends stopped calling. Invitations to parties and events became less frequent, even at church, where forgiveness was supposed to be a given. There was a new distance in the way people greeted them. Sophie, in particular, seemed to feel the change most acutely. She confided in a mutual friend that she felt isolated, that she missed the sense of belonging she had once taken for granted. Brian, for his part, became more withdrawn, spending long hours at work or at home. I heard from neighbors that he was struggling, that the business was barely holding on, that he seemed lost. I tried, in small ways, to reach out. I sent cards on birthdays and anniversaries, left flowers on their porch, offered quiet words of encouragement when I saw them in town, sometimes. Brian would respond with a brief thank you. But more often, there was only silence. I learned to accept it, to let go of the hope that things would return to the way they had been. As summer deepened, the scholarship fund began to take shape. Applications poured in from students across the county, each one a reminder of the potential that lay waiting in our community. I worked with Mr. Callahan and a small committee to review the essays, to interview the candidates, to choose the first recipients. It was hard work, but it was also deeply rewarding. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was making a difference. The day we awarded the first scholarships was one I will never forget. The recipients and their families gathered in the community center, dressed in their best clothes, their faces shining with pride and hope. As I handed out the certificates, I thought of Helen, of the dreams we had shared, of the belief that every child deserved a chance. I felt her presence beside me, quiet and steady, and I knew that she would have been proud. After the ceremony, as I stood in the empty hall, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought of Brian, of the path that had led us here, of the choices we had both made. I did not know what the future held, but I knew that I had done my best. I had honored Helen's memory, and in doing so, I had found a measure of peace. The community, too, seemed to settle into a new equilibrium. The gossip faded, replaced by a quiet respect. People began to see the scholarship fund not as a punishment for Brian, but as a gift to the town. They saw the students who would benefit, the families who would be changed, the future that was being built one small step at a time. Brian and Sophie. Meanwhile, I continued to struggle. The business limped along. But the sense of purpose and pride that had once defined our family seemed to have vanished. I saw them less and less. And when I did, there was a distance between us that felt insurmountable. I grieved for what we had lost, but I also knew that I could not go back. In the quiet moments, as I sat in the garden or walked through the town, I found comfort in the knowledge that I had done what was right. I had chosen integrity over convenience, a responsibility over resentment, love over fear. I had learned, at last, to let go. As the summer drew to a close, I looked forward to the future with a sense of cautious hope. I did not know if Brian and I would ever be close again, but I knew that I had given him every chance. I had loved him fiercely, forgiven him often, and finally, set him free. And in doing so, I had set myself free as well. The end of summer brought a subtle shift in the air, a coolness that crept in during the evenings and lingered in the mornings. I found myself spending more time in the garden, watching the leaves begin to turn and the last of the tomatoes ripen on the vine. There was a sense of closure in the changing season, a quiet reminder that nothing lasts forever, not the warmth of summer, not the pain of loss. not even the distance between a mother and her child. The sunlight grew softer, slanting through the trees in golden ribbons, and the days seemed to slow down, inviting reflection. It was during these days that I began to hear more about Brian and Sophie's struggles. The whispers that had once been about my decision to change the will now centered on their difficulties. The business, already on shaky ground, was faltering. Clients were leaving, bills were piling up, and the bank had started to call in loans. Sophie, who had once been the center of every social gathering, was now rarely seen in town. Friends who had once flocked to their home for parties and celebrations now kept their distance, unsure of what to say or how to help. Even the house itself seemed quieter, its windows dark more often than not, as if it, too, was holding its breath. I heard from a neighbor that Brian had started selling off equipment from the company, trying to keep the doors open a little longer. There were rumors of arguments between him and Sophie, of late nights spent poring over bills and bank statements, of a growing sense of desperation that hung over their home like a storm cloud. I tried not to dwell on these stories, but it was impossible not to feel a pang of sorrow for the son I had once known, the boy who had run through these very gardens with laughter in his voice and hope in his eyes. One afternoon, as I was weeding the flower beds, I saw Sophie walking down the street, her shoulders hunched and her face drawn. She glanced in my direction but did not wave. I watched her disappear around the corner, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but I knew that any gesture from me would likely be met with suspicion or anger. The wounds between us were still too fresh, the lines too clearly drawn. As the weeks passed, the situation grew more dire. The business was forced to lay off several employees, some of whom had worked for Richard for decades. The news hit the community hard, and for the first time, I sensed a shift in the way people spoke about Brian. There was less sympathy now, more frustration and disappointment. Some blamed him for mismanaging the company, for squandering the legacy his father had built. Others simply shook their heads and said it was a shame, a tragedy that could have been avoided. I tried to keep my distance, to focus on my own life and the work I was doing with the scholarship fund, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of Brian's choices, not to wonder if there was something more I could have done. I found myself replaying old memories, searching for the moment when things had started to go wrong. Was it a single decision? A missed opportunity? Or simply the slow accumulation of small mistakes and unspoken resentments? Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would sit by the window and watch the wind scatter leaves across the yard, thinking of all the ways life can change in a single season. One evening, as I was closing up the house for the night, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I hesitated. It had been months since Brian had come to see me, and I was not sure I was ready for whatever conversation awaited us. But as I opened the door, I saw not the confident, self-assured man I remembered, but a version of my son I had not seen in years. He looked tired, his clothes rumpled, his eyes shadowed with worry. He stood on the porch for a long moment before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. He apologized for the way things had turned out, for the words that had been said, for the choices that had led us to this place. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he make excuses. Instead, he simply stood there, vulnerable and uncertain, waiting for me to respond. I invited him inside, and we sat together in the living room, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. He told me about the business, about the debts and the layoffs, about the strain it had put on his marriage, and he spoke of his regrets, of the things he wished he had done differently, of the ways he had let down not only himself but also Richard, Helen, and me. As he spoke, that I felt a mixture of pain and pride. Pain for the suffering he had endured, pride for the courage it took to admit his mistakes. We talked late into the night, sharing memories and hopes, fears and disappointments. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of connection, a glimmer of the bond that had once been so strong between us. I did not offer easy answers or promises of reconciliation, but I listened. And in listening, I offered the only gift I had left: my presence. my understanding, my love. In the days that followed, Brian began to visit more often. Sometimes he would help me in the garden, his hands clumsy but willing as he pulled weeds or planted bulbs. Other times, we would sit on the porch, watching the sun set and the stars appear one by one in the evening sky. Our conversations were tentative at first, filled with pauses and careful words, but gradually, a sense of trust began to grow. There were moments when we would both fall silent, simply enjoying the comfort of being together, letting the past rest for a while. Sophie, too, reached out in her own way. She sent a note thanking me for the scholarship fund, for the difference it had made in the lives of so many young people. She did not mention the past, nor did she ask for forgiveness, but her words were sincere, and I found myself hoping that, in time, we might find a way to move forward. Despite these small steps toward healing, the challenges facing Brian and Sophie did not disappear. The business continued to struggle, and eventually, by said, they were forced to sell the company. The house, once filled with laughter and light, was put on the market, and they moved into a smaller place on the edge of town. It was a humbling experience, one that stripped away the last remnants of pride and pretense. Through it all, I tried to be a steady presence in their lives, not as a savior, but as a mother who loved her child, flaws and all. I offered support when it was needed, advice when it was asked for, and space when it was not. I learned to let go of my expectations, to accept Brian and Sophie as they were, not as I wished them to be. As autumn arrived, bringing with it a riot of color and a crispness in the air, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had taken. There had been so much pain, so much loss, but also moments of grace and redemption. I thought of Helen and Richard, of the lessons they had taught me about love and forgiveness, about the importance of holding on and letting go. One afternoon, as I was raking leaves in the yard, Brian joined me. We worked side by side in companionable silence, the sound of the rake scraping against the ground a soothing rhythm. After a while, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. He thanked me for not giving up on him, for believing that he could change, for loving him even when he had made it so difficult. I looked at him, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy he had once been, the boy who had needed so much, who had taken so much, but who was now learning, at last, to give something back. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace, a sense that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The scholarship fund continued to grow, touching more lives with each passing year. I received letters from students and their families, stories of hope and gratitude that reminded me of the power of second chances. The community, too, seemed to heal, the old wounds fading as new connections were forged. Brian and Sophie found their own path, one marked by humility and hard work. They rebuilt their lives, slowly and quietly, learning to live within their means and to find joy in the simple things. Our relationship was not perfect. There were still moments of tension, still scars that would never fully heal, but there was also laughter and love and the knowledge that we had survived the storm. As winter approached, I found myself looking forward to the holidays with a sense of anticipation I had not felt in years. I decorated the house with garlands and lights, baked cookies using Helen's old recipes, and invited Brian and Sophie to join me for dinner. They accepted. And as we sat around the table, sharing stories and memories, I felt a sense of gratitude for the journey we had taken. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations, just the quiet, steady work of rebuilding a family. One day at a time, I knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and fear, but I also knew that we were stronger now, tempered by the trials we had faced. In the stillness of the evening, as I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, I thought of Helen and Richard, of the legacy they had left behind. I thought of the garden, now sleeping beneath a blanket of frost, and of the promise of spring that lay hidden in the earth. I thought of Brian and Sophie, of the love that had survived so much, and of the hope that, in the end, we would find our way home. And as the snow began to fall outside, soft and silent, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for forgiveness, for resilience, for the chance to begin again. And as the wind rattled softly against the window, I felt a quiet certainty that whatever storms might come, we would weather them together, bound by the lessons of the past and the love that had endured. The first true snow of winter arrived quietly, blanketing the garden and the rooftops in a hush that seemed to slow the world. I woke early that morning, drawn to the window by the pale light, and watched as the flakes drifted down, softening every edge and erasing the scars of autumn. There was a peace in that silence, a sense of the world pausing to breathe, and I found myself grateful for the stillness. It was a time for reflection, for letting go of the old year and making space for whatever might come next. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, I settled into a gentle rhythm. I spent my mornings reading by the fire, my afternoons writing letters or working on small projects for the scholarship fund, and my evenings wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and watching the snow fall outside. The house felt warm and safe, filled with the quiet echoes of laughter and love that had once filled every room. I missed Helen and Richard, of course, but their presence lingered in the familiar creak of the stairs, the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, the faded photographs on the mantel. Sometimes, I would pause in the hallway and run my fingers along the old banister, remembering the years of footsteps small and large that had passed up and down, the echoes of family life that still seemed to hum in the walls. Brian and Sophie visited more often now, sometimes bringing a casserole or a bouquet of winter flowers, sometimes coming just to sit and share a cup of coffee. Our conversations were easy, unhurried, and though there were still moments of awkwardness, the old tension had faded. We spoke of simple things: the weather, the garden, the latest news from the scholarship recipients. Sometimes, in the quiet, I would catch Brian watching me with a look I couldn't quite name, a mixture of regret and gratitude. And I would smile, letting him know that all was forgiven, even if not everything was forgotten. The holidays arrived with a flurry of activity. I decorated the house with garlands and candles, baked Helen's favorite gingerbread cookies, and invited a few close friends to join us for Christmas dinner. The table was smaller than it had once been, but the warmth and laughter were genuine. Brian and Sophie brought a homemade pie, and as we sat together, sharing stories and memories, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known in years. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations, just the quiet, steady work of loving and being loved, of building something new from the pieces of the past. After dinner, we lingered by the fire, sipping mulled wine and listening to old carols, the glow of the candles casting gentle shadows on the walls. I watched Brian and Sophie laugh together, their faces softened by the firelight, and felt a deep, quiet joy settle in my chest. In the new year, I found myself drawn more and more to the scholarship fund. The first group of students had graduated, and their letters filled me with pride and hope. Some had gone on to college, others had started jobs or apprenticeships, but all of them wrote of the difference the fund had made in their lives. Their gratitude was humbling, a reminder that even small acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways we cannot imagine. I began to attend more community events, speaking about Helen's legacy and encouraging others to support the next generation. It was good work, honest work, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I had not felt since Richard and Helen were alive. Sometimes, after a long day, I would sit at my desk and reread the students' letters, letting their words remind me that hope is always possible, even after the hardest seasons. Brian, too, seemed to find his footing. He took a job with a local contractor, working long hours but coming home each night with a sense of accomplishment. Sophie started volunteering at the library, organizing story hours for children and helping with the annual book sale. Their lives were simpler now, stripped of the old pretenses and pressures. But there was a quiet joy in their routines. They learned to live within their means, to find happiness in small pleasures: a walk in the snow, a shared meal, a letter from an old friend. Sometimes, on weekends, they would invite me to join them for a walk through the park. And we would watch the children sledding down the hill, their laughter ringing out in the cold air. on those walks. I would sometimes reach out and take Sophie's hand, and she would squeeze mine in return, a silent gesture of understanding and forgiveness. There were moments when we would stop and watch the sunset behind the trees, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, and I would feel a quiet gratitude for the simple beauty of the world and the second chances we had been given. Our relationship was not perfect. There were still moments of misunderstanding, still scars that would never fully heal. But there was also laughter and forgiveness and the knowledge that we had survived the storm together. I learned to let go of my expectations, to accept Brian and Sophie as they were, not as I wished them to be. In doing so, I found a freedom I had never known, a freedom to love without fear, to give without resentment, to hope without regret. As spring approached, I began to spend more time in the garden, clearing away the dead branches and preparing the soil for new growth. The work was slow and sometimes difficult, but it was also deeply satisfying. I planted daffodils and tulips, remembering how Helen had loved their bright colors, and watched as the first shoots pushed through the earth. There was a lesson in that renewal, a reminder that even after the harshest winter, life finds a way to begin again. The robins returned, their songs filling the morning air, and I felt a sense of anticipation for the season ahead. I found myself planning new flower beds, sketching ideas in a notebook, and feeling a quiet excitement for the future. One afternoon, as I was pruning the rose bushes, Brian joined me. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the sun warm on our backs. After a while, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. He thanked me for everything, for the second chances, for the patience, for the love that had endured even when he had made it so difficult. I looked at him, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy he had once been, and I felt a surge of pride. I told him that love is not a transaction, not something that can be earned or lost, but a gift we give freely, again and again. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, I thought of Helen and Richard, of the journey we had taken, of the lessons we had learned. I thought of the garden, now coming back to life, and of the promise of another season. I thought of Brian and Sophie, of the family we had rebuilt, and of the hope that, whatever the future held, we would face it together. There was a quiet closure in those days, a sense that the story was not ending, but simply turning a page. I no longer measured my worth by the choices Brian made, nor did I carry the weight of his mistakes as my own. I had learned to forgive not just him, but myself for all the ways we had failed each other, for all the things we could not change. As the days grew longer and the world warmed, I found myself looking forward to the future with a sense of peace. I knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear, but I also knew that we were stronger now, tempered by the trials we had faced. I was grateful for the journey, for the love that had survived, for the chance to begin again. And so, as the first daffodils bloomed in the garden and the robins returned to their nests, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for Helen, for Richard, for Brian and Sophie, for the community that had carried us through. I thanked the world for forgiveness, for resilience, for the quiet, steady work of hope. And as the sun rose over the garden, I stepped forward into the new day, ready for whatever might come, my heart full and at peace. And in that golden light, I finally understood that every ending is also a beginning, and that love, in its quiet persistence, is what carries us home. And as I breathed in the scent of earth and new grass, I felt Helen's spirit beside me, gentle and proud. And I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. And in that moment, I realized that the greatest gift we can give each other is not perfection, but presence and the willingness to begin again, together.